What's going on, guys? This is Empty Box, and we're back at it again with the American Open Wheel racing history, this time 2000 through 2003. These 4 years would be the end of Karts, and therefore the arrival of the IRL as the major American Open Wheel racing series. So, going into 2000, Kart had started to trend the wrong way, as talked about in the previous episodes. For the most part, still during this time, the IRL was more or less just sort of something that was there in the background, except for one race a year, that being the Indy 500, of course. By the time you get to 2000, though, the trend would go the other way around in a slow but very obvious way, steamrolling very quickly and gathering momentum. In other words, the lines were about to be redrawn. So first off, for 2000, the Indy Racing League would finally have some more well-known star power in the form of a driver known as Al Unser Jr., Little Al. He would be switching from kart, where his career had just kind of gone the wrong way, as Penske had kind of gone the wrong way, more or less, and he'd be switching over into the Indy Racing League to race in the Indy 500 primarily, but cause and effect. While he was never particularly amazing, certainly not living up to his successes in the 80s and 90s, when he jumped into the IRL, his arrival did provide some name recognition and therefore legitimacy to the series, and certainly had to be counted as a big win for the Indy Racing League. But of course, there was a bigger step across party lines in 2000, and that would be Ganassi heading to Indianapolis to run in the Indy 500 as a one-off, one-and-done Indy Racing League appearance at the time. Sponsors wanted in. They wanted to win the biggest race around that they possibly could. There was no reason they couldn't or shouldn't. The 25-8 rule was long gone. The only thing that was keeping teams from running in the Indianapolis 500 from the kart side were the fact that the cars were different and obviously, the political nature of it. With the Indy Racing League teams being the Indy Racing League teams, the result would end up being incredibly predictable for kart fans. The detractors, or should I say the IRL diehards, said a rookie couldn't run Indy the way Montoya was doing it. He was running too aggressive. He ran a funny line at the speedway that would end up biting him because it bites everyone and it owes no one. They said a team couldn't just roll up, unpack, do one race in a totally different car, once a year and win. Those guys were wrong. Ganassi and Montoya did indeed roll up, unpacked in May 2000, and dominated. Montoya won the race, leading 167 of 200 laps along the way. It wasn't just that they won, it was the way they won, which, as you can probably figure out, was convincingly. With someone having made that jump across the party lines, the floodgates were now open. The kart power teams now had even more pressure to race in the 500, given how relatively easily Ganassi had handled the field. The sponsors basically said, wait, why wasn't that us and our logos winning that race? The power of the Indy 500 and what it represents pushed them further because it is the Indy 500. It was open season to bag a 500 victory, providing you cross party lines, and it was very obvious. In fact, since that year in 2000, each team to win the Indy 500 has had ties to kart. Like I said, the IRL teams were the IRL teams. Moving outside of open wheel racing for a moment, NASCAR would make its big appearance on the national stage around this time. By 2000, the series had really grown into a more national series. 2001, they would have a new TV contract, which would give them an even bigger audience. And then there was the 2001 Daytona 500, which is something entirely different. But right about now is where NASCAR becomes a very, very, very serious threat and was basically going to wipe out open wheel racing. But let's get back to what we're here for, which is cars without fenders, and therefore, let's talk about April 2001. And of course, that would be Kart's infamous Firestone Firehawk 600 at Texas Motor Speedway, and the nearly as infamous movie Driven. In a matter of a week, Kart would manage to throw itself off into the deep end with concrete boots on. It's often overlooked or forgotten today, but the movie Driven released the same week as the canceled Firestone Firehawk 600. As for the movie, it really looked to take the Days of Thunder formula from the 1980s and redo it all, only in a different series, more or less. Someone had thought that making an over-the-top cheeseball action movie with Sylvester Stallone driving champ cars would end up being a good idea, and there's nothing about that is a good idea, and it just made all the sense in the world that it is going to be a failure. But ridiculous crashes and everything. They sent Max Pappas up into the low Earth orbit in one of the crashes, if I remember correctly. It is just terrible movie. It is a movie that is as bad as a movie with a Metascore of 29 is, because it has a Metascore of 29. It is a terrible movie, and you should feel bad if you actually like it. Just saying. As for the race in the real world, there wasn't one. Despite having tested in the off-season at Texas Motor Speedway and been deemed safe for competition, the speeds were best described as absolutely unhinged come race time. Either through sandbagging in the off-season, too cold of weather and testing to accurately judge some of the improvements made to the track in preparation of the events. The average lap speeds went around from 225 miles an hour during the tests to over 235 miles an hour in practice during the race weekend. 235 miles per hour average speeds around a 1.5 mile oval. They had reached the absolute limit of what a human being could handle in a racing car. Thanks to the long, high-banked corners, the G-loading was simply too much at those speeds to handle for the length of time required around that track. With most of the drivers reporting dizziness, blurred vision, lack of balance, or just other issues throughout the week, drivers blacking out on track due to the lack of blood flow to their brain was a very, very real concern. We're talking about sustained G-loadings of over 5 Gs. And some people might say 5 Gs, that's not too far off of Formula One and what they're doing today and all that. And what's the big difference? The big difference is it was a sustained loading over the course of a lap, and there was very little time for the drivers to actually rest and recuperate from those G loadings. And you basically end up in a situation where, on a road course, they may pull 5 Gs in Formula One, but it's a relatively short, sharp loading compared to a track like Texas and Kart, where they had, basically half the lap was done at 5+ Gs, and then you had relatively short straightaways because you're doing 240 miles an hour, and that all led to a very dangerous situation. Kart was caught off guard by the increased speeds and never handled the situation well at the track, as no one had ever seen a situation like this. By the time it became clear that this was a very real safety issue, it was too late to evaluate the various options that could be used to slow the speeds, such as removing downforce from the cars or limiting the turbo boost. There was no plan, there was no contingencies, because this is something that quite literally never happens. Ultimately, Kart made the 100% correct decision and canceled the race. However, even that was handled poorly, with apparently 60,000 fans having shown up to the track the morning of the race, only to find out then and there on the spot that the race was canceled. Oh yes, there would be a backlash. Of course, in these highly charged political times between Kart and the IRL, naturally, the IRL fans took the time to mock the Kart drivers who, in their eyes, quote-unquote, chickened out, even though it was obviously the only sensible option. It was fodder for them, after all. If the boys in the IRL could handle driving at Texas Motor Speedway and put on some great racing out there, why were the Kart guys, who were supposedly so good, and so fast and everything, a bunch of wusses who chickened out, right? They couldn't handle it? Of course, these nonsense opinions ignore the incredible jump in danger from 220 mile an hour, IRL lap speeds to 235 plus mile per hour Kart lap speeds. And the fact that, it would have been the most dangerous race in modern racing by a healthy margin, as big of a safety issue as this was. Now, if you go back to the movie Driven, obviously, that movie was supposed to give the series the mainstream appeal, and this is supposed to be a huge deal. That movie featured, obviously, ridiculous explosions and over-the-top crashes and just shenanigans. So on one hand, you had the silver screen, with the over-the-top action, while the rest of the time in the real world, you're like, oh wait, we got to cancel this race due to a very serious safety issue. It's mixed messaging at best. And obviously, for the 60,000 fans who are said to have shown up at the race that morning, obviously this is not a good way to endear yourselves to the fans as a series. And then, of course, the lawyers got involved. So after the race was canceled, there obviously goes into that phase, what are we going to do? Are we going to reschedule the race, postpone the race, cancel the race, all that? And CART basically said that they had no place on the schedule, quote unquote, which I think if you read between the lines was rather, given the farce that this was, we have no desire to reschedule and we're just going to ignore Texas Motor Speedway. So now Texas Motor Speedway starts suing CART, the series, because, well, they just lost their race date that they were supposed to have. They sold all the tickets and everything. So now they're basically stuck in the middle, more or less. And on top of that, apparently Texas Motor Speedway had warned CART after the tests that they had done originally that validated the track was safe to race on for these cars, stating that, hey, you guys should come back and test again because we think the speeds might get a little bit out of hand and you guys need to be prepared for this. CART took no action on that, and eventually that was more or less the damning evidence. Yes, the track that was the low light of the Indy Racing League in 1997 was the low light of CART come 2001. In the end, a settlement was reached out of court in favor of Texas Motor Speedway. It was estimated that CART paid Texas Motor Speedway about $5 million or so. But what was more important was the PR blunder that the whole race had been. And a series that was on increasingly thin ice, it was just one more crack showing up, and very, very, very thin ice that CART was now standing on. And then a month later, Helio Castroneves, driving for Team Penske, the CART powerhouse that made the jump over to Indianapolis for that month in 2001, would end up winning the race. In case it wasn't clear, 2000 was no fluke. The CART teams were going to have a field day at Indianapolis, dominating the IRL teams. And then, later in 2001, in September, we come to CART's European expansion that we had talked about in the previous episode. Well, obviously, the series was in a very different position by the time that these plans were actually completed and in motion than when they were thought of. Even worse, the first of the European races, which was at Eurospeedway Lausitz in Germany, on the oval there, would be the weekend after 9/11. While basically every sporting series in America was canceling events or at least postponing them in the wake of the terrorist attacks, CART was stuck between two continents. On one hand, out of respect, the race should have been canceled. On the other hand, a flyaway race wasn't something that could just be canceled in an instant once things were already rolling. CART would eventually run the race, which would draw the ire of some, but at best, it's just not a good look for the series in its position. Now, looking back today, that wasn't really the thing that sticks with that race in particular. What it's become remembered as, is the race where Alex Zanardi lost his legs in a terrible accident. Exiting pit road under green late in the race, Zanardi spun off the access road, putting his car stationary sideways right in the middle of the track on the racing line, and then he was T-boned by Alex Tagliani. The European expansion of CART arrived 5 years too late on one of the worst weekends it possibly could have arrived on, and resulted in one of the series' most popular drivers having his legs amputated after nearly dying in a horrific crash. And of course, it would get better, because for 2002, Penske would defect to the IRL full-time exclusively. And with him would go the tracks that he once owned, sold to International Speedway, otherwise known as basically NASCAR, back in the late 90s, which meant that Michigan, California, and Nazareth, three staple tracks, were now no longer CART tracks, but rather IRL tracks. It was a big win for the Indy Racing League, and losing 3 oval races at one time, as well as Team Penske, put CART in an area where oval racing was an occasional twist rather than a part of the series, as well as it lost one of the biggest, if not the biggest name in terms of the teams around in North American racing, period, really. 2002 would also see Ganassi field a car in the Indy Racing League for the full season as well, while they still maintained a presence in CART. They were kind of stuck in between two different directions at the time, but the writing was on the wall. Team Green, one of the other CART power teams, would also jump in and run the Indy 500 as well. And of course, as mentioned previously in sort of the previous episode of this series, Renard would end up going bankrupt, which would have far wider implication years into the future. So really by the start of 2002, it was clear that CART was toast. The series was pointed into the ground and traveling at a very rapid velocity. Kart had become a losing proposition, crumbling under its own weight. The series had just become a money pit, too much investment for increasingly little return. As for the 2002 Indy 500, it can be best described as controversial. I'm going to be a bit biased here, I will admit. At the end of the race, there would be a tremendous outside pass in turn 3 by Paul Tracy, driving for Team Green, right around the outside of Helio Castroneves and the Penske, who is by now a full-fledged Indy Racing League team. I mean, it was one of the greatest moves ever, round the outside turn 3 to win the Indy 500. It's the stuff legends are made of. Well, it ended up being legendary, but not for the right reasons. Except right at the exact instant that Tracy was passing Castroneves, there was a yellow flag thrown because there was a crash behind on the track. There are no green-white checkers or anything like that. It was late in the race, so this yellow flag was going to end the race. Whoever was in the lead would end up winning the race. At minimum, Tracy was alongside Castroneves when the yellow flag came out and the caution lights turned on the track. At best, he was already past Castroneves when the lights turned on. I'm going to say it. Paul Tracy won the 2002 Indy 500, and we all know it. But his face isn't on the trophy. And of course, because of the circumstances, everything descended into chaos. With some careful examination of the various replay angles and the caution lights around the track, it still could be determined either way as to who was actually ahead when the caution came out. It was that close. Like, this was one of the closest Indy 500s in history in this sense. It's basically like the IndyCar Zapruder film, like frame-by-frame analysis of a low-resolution, grainy video, and there's still a lot of gray area and questions, and everybody's got their own opinion on it. But thanks to some goofy rules that will never make any sense at all, it was entirely moot, as according to the IRL rules, the timing reverted to the previous lap, meaning that even if Tracy did actually pass Helio, and we all know he did, it didn't matter because that's not how the IRL works. It was a farce. So you end up in a situation where the guy who won the race was clearly being passed and clearly would have been passed. And then, you explain that with the timing reverts to the previous lap. It's just like, what kind of a lame-o answer is this? What kind of a series would have this, the timing reverts to the previous lap? It made the whole thing look like an absolute joke. And of course, given the political climate between the two series, it was fodder for discussion. Kart fans will still insist that the Indy Racing League was protecting the 500 from being cherry-picked by a kart team once again. And while the result would officially be protested, the end result is now the one we have written in the history books, and that is Helio Castroneves won the 2002 Indy 500. Even though Paul Tracy is the real winner and we all know it, I'm still calling BS on it. Just saying. I've made peace, but I do not need to accept it. And then Kart fully popped off just to go ahead and end itself, more or less. At Detroit, Kart would mandate a new pop-off valve. These are devices that are used to relieve excess manifold pressure, which basically means to keep them from running too much turbo boost and therefore keep them from having too much power. The manufacturers were less than thrilled by this. You see, the valves were nothing new, but a few of the manufacturers had figured out how to design the manifolds in such a fashion to enable a higher pressure than what was supposed to be legal without actually causing the pop-off valve to pop off and thus relieving the illegally high pressure. Again, this was nothing new. Pop-off valve controversies and conspiracies are as old as the devices are themselves in relation to these cars, but this was the final straw. But with the new pop-off valve design, these creative approaches to design to basically circumvent the device were rendered irrelevant because they would now correctly release the overpressure situation, and therefore the power advantage was moot. Naturally, this was something that some manufacturers would lose out on, and their crafty power advantage would be rendered useless. But even those who wouldn't be hindered as much by this new valve could very well argue that they weren't fully tested, because they weren't fully tested. It was more or less just kind of a, oh yeah, by the way, we're doing this, put this on your car, have fun. Honda and Toyota would be joining the Indy Racing League for 2003 and ditching karts. It's often said that this is the reason that pushed them over the edge. However, I think if you look at everything, it is far, far more simple. This pop-off valve controversy was more or less a very good way to point the finger and blame the series in karts and exit the series that was clearly headed in the wrong direction and go spend their money in another series that actually perhaps had a future without having the fan backlash, because again, the kart fans, the Indy Racing League fans, they didn't really get along too terribly well. I mean, this is the American open wheel racing civil war, as we discussed in our first video. And then FedEx, who had been the title sponsor of the kart series, decided not to return in 2003 as well, because who could blame them? It was a lot of money spent for, well, increasingly little return. Kart, which would become known as the Champ Car World Series powered by Ford, was left up a creek without a paddle for 2003. With Reynard being no more, that left only Lola as a viable chassis. The other engine manufacturers were gone, and even Ford was largely there just because someone's got to be there and you can safely detune the engines and not really have the same strain, to compete against other manufacturers. So, yeah, I guess. In other words, de facto spec racing had arrived. Team Green, which had become known as Andretti Green Racing, which has now become known as Andretti Autosports, would jump ship to the IRL full-time in 2003, sucking even more talent from the kart series. This would leave just Forsythe and Newman Haas as the only two power teams remaining in kart. So in other words, it would become Paul Tracy versus Sebastian Bourdais. After the 2003 season, kart would declare bankruptcy, stating a $77.9 million loss for the first 9 months of 2003 alone. Kart's assets were liquidated and eventually scooped up by Forsythe, Kevin Kalkoven, and Paul Gentilozzi as the Open Wheel Racing Series group, which more or less then morphed into Champ Car World Series once again. Naturally, Tony George was interested in buying the kart assets and more or less putting the split to an end right then and there. This move was denied, though, as apparently the former kart vendors wouldn't have been paid under this agreement, while with the eventual Champ Car World Series agreement ownership, they would indeed be paid. I'm not entirely clear on that, but one does have to wonder what would have happened if the split ended in 2003. Meanwhile, the Indy Racing League had built a reputation for close pack racing and tight finishes, and they finally had the drivers, the teams, the name recognition to actually make it a viable series for the future. And I'll sort of expand on things and events. I want to cover it in a separate video, though, because it doesn't really make sense here. You guys will see what I mean in the next video if you choose to watch that when it does release. But, yeah, what a difference 4 years made. What a difference. But anyways, hope you guys have enjoyed. Bye.